We're talking today about a composer and a work that is very familiar, I think, to all of you. I may or may not be the only silverhead old person in the room who fears repeating himself a little bit. So I'm just going to say we've now done all of the Da Ponte operas within living memory, Così fan tutte, Don Giovanni, and Nozze di Figaro. And so I have talked to you a lot about the librettist Lorenzo Da Ponte, about the different technical ingredients that go into a Mozart opera buffa and what opera buffa is in the first place. If I was to mention the term recitativo accompagnato, are you all thoroughly familiar with what that is? Or would you like, so if I go over some of the same ground again, you won't mind? Okay, because I probably am going to then. So the next thing to bring up is the various ways in which the Mozart opera buffa or comic operas have been dealt with by stage directors, mostly in the past 30 or 40 years. I've mentioned the name Peter Sellers in connection with a great many works. He wasn't the first person to do something startling with the Marriage of Figaro. He said it in Trump Towers, which has much more resonance today than when he did that. I'm not sure what this director is going to do, but I've seen the costume design. They look more like Gosford Park, which I think has a kind of relationship to the very, very strict hierarchy of social stratum that you see in the Marriage of Figaro. It's something that we sometimes forget is essential to an understanding of the piece and where it comes from. So I'll mention a few things like that today. But the first thing, I guess, is it is an opera buffa. In the 18th century, there were several types of opera, we'll call it music theater perhaps, that were successfully being produced in the city of Vienna. They include opera seria, and Ian mentioned La Clemenza di Tito, which is Mozart's last opera seria. That will be more like a Handel opera, in that it's based on usually a mythological or historical subject, and the traditions tended to remain somewhat static in the 18th century. Doesn't mean that the opera isn't dramatic, just that it's a very different kind of animal. Then we have Mozart's other last opera, which is The Magic Flute, which has also been produced by POV recently, which is in the genre known as the Singspiel, which is to say German language and with spoken dialogue rather than recitativo secco, which probably I should explain to you as well. Now, opera buffa is more than just comic opera. It allowed the more imaginative and experimental composers and librettists to create a new kind of opera, a new kind of music drama and theater that dealt with contemporary subject matter. And it allowed, or it certainly invited, the imaginative composer and librettist to move beyond the traditions that were sort of hampering to the composers of opera seria. That is to say, it's not just a succession of arias. It has ensembles when it seems dramatically necessary to have them. And that's what we're going to see with the Marriage of Figaro. Now, Mozart was certainly, as his letters and biographical data would indicate, a person who was interested in current affairs. He and his father both liked to attend the salons that were active in Vienna. I said his father, when his father was in Vienna, which wasn't that often. Mozart enjoyed going to people's homes and talking about current affairs and philosophies about them and things, but he was, first and foremost, a musician. So we don't see Mozart involving himself with politics of the day the way we see Beethoven and Wagner and Verdi associating with the politics of the day, but he was aware of what was going on. This is important to remember as we look into this particular work. And the other thing to ask ourselves is, of course, Mozart was a German speaker. He was fortunate enough to have traveled widely as a young person and therefore acquired at least some fluency in other languages. But he was a native German speaker. And of course, during his own life, German became the official language of Austria under the auspices of Emperor Joseph. So I think this is a question we should ask ourselves, just like we ask ourselves when Handel had his heyday in London writing Italian opera. What was with these Austrians? Why was Italian opera the equivalent of the movies of the day? Why was it the popular entertainment? I think it's almost impossible to answer that question. But there was a thriving community of Italian operatic professionals working and living in Vienna at the time. And one of the standard bearers of this Italian opera, one of the people who helped form and helped create the soil that Mozart grew in, was a Czech named Gluck, Christoph Willibald von Gluck. So it seems to have been the international language of music theater and of entertainment of the time. And one of the professionals that was thriving, well, maybe he came to thrive in Vienna, was an Italian Jew who was born in Venice, in the Jewish ghetto of Venice, who found himself named Lorenzo Da Ponte. Now, does that name ring a bell with anybody? Would you like me to tell you about Lorenzo? Good. I'm going to anyway. So unless you flee the room, you're going to hear the story. Lorenzo da Ponte was one of 3 sons born to a Jewish family who lost their mother. And the father fell in love with a Gentile girl, and in order to marry her legally, he had to convert to Christianity. And so he did this, and the conversion was performed by a bishop named Lorenzo da Ponte. And the tradition at the time was that one of the sons would take the name of the bishop and then pursue a career in the church. And that's what this young fellow did. He became a priest. Now, what is so interesting about this is that no priest in the history of the Catholic Church has ever been so ill-suited to the priesthood than Lorenzo da Ponte, for several reasons. And the first one is his gift for language. It's said that he could improvise poetry as flawlessly and as quickly as Mozart could improvise music, which is something, that's an achievement. He was fortunate enough to have amongst his professors a Jesuit priest who was fanatical about literature and about language, and he passed this on to his pupil. And so Lorenzo da Ponte had a thrilling gift for words. Obviously an ear for the type of words that went with music, otherwise he wouldn't have been so successful as an operatic librettist. But he was a poet. Also, he was a writer of contemporary topical criticism. It's said that he had an unparalleled gift for wit and sarcasm, rapier-like wit. This is going to get him into some trouble. So that brings me to the next thing. So first of all, he had a gift that far exceeded any aptitude he had for the priesthood. Also, he was a bit of a political hothead, what we might call a radical. And even in so tolerant a city as Venice, it could get him into hot water. And ultimately, he found himself with a warrant out for his arrest. And it's likely that this is due not so much to the sentiments he was expressing, but to the wit and clarity with which he was able to express them. He was basically viewed as a potential threat. I saw a picture of one of the tombs, or well, it was like a tomb, one of the dungeons where he would have been kept had he been caught. And it was small enough that you could neither lie down nor stand up in it. And so if somebody was sentenced to a term of 7 years, I don't think they'd survive, and their brain would be mush if they did. So he got himself out of Venice, just in the nick of time. But there were other reasons he was ill-suited to the priesthood. First of all, he had an absolutely insatiable appetite for ladies, particularly ladies who were either married or affianced to somebody else. So he quite often would have to leave town under cover of darkness because he was being pursued by angry husbands or fiancés or brothers or uncles or fathers. But that wasn't the only thing. There's still one other thing, and that is this. He was like Wagner in this regard. He believed that the world kind of owed him a living. It owed him everything. So he would often run up great debts at all the local businesses, and he had no intention of paying them off. So if he wasn't being pursued by angry lovers and husbands, he was being pursued by creditors and bill collectors. So he moved around the world a lot. Let's put him in Vienna now. And there's a story I must share with you, and that is this. He was seen in a cafe by a man whose fiancée he'd been involved with. Lorenzo met this woman who was engaged to someone else, and for some reason she preferred him, so they had a little affair. And the guy knew about it, and he saw Lorenzo in this cafe rubbing his cheek in obvious distress and pain, and so he went up to Lorenzo and says, "Hey Lorenzo, what's the matter? You don't look too good." And Lorenzo had just had a tooth extracted. So let's have a moment's silence for people who underwent dental surgery in the 18th century. And so the guy said, I got just the thing, wait right here. And he went home and came back with a little bit of ointment. He said, rub this on your tooth and the pain will go away. And it did, it worked miraculously. So Lorenzo went home, and fortunately his housekeeper saw him with this ointment, and what it was boot polish, and it was highly toxic. And so he, of course, didn't use it anymore, but it still caused him to lose most of the teeth, and they fell out of his head one by one. He had periodic gastrointestinal difficulties for the rest of his life, so this was really poisonous stuff. But he was still irresistible to women. So I'll jump ahead of myself a little bit to finish him off. He did ultimately leave Vienna after the death of Joseph. Vienna just was no longer interesting to him or interested in him, so he went to London. By this time he was married. And he set up a used bookstore in London and, of course, went bankrupt and owed everybody money, so he had to get out of London, which is not a small city, so he must have run up a large number of enemies. And so he went to the New World, where I read that briefly he operated a hardware store in Erie, Pennsylvania. But he ended up in New York City, where he taught Italian at what is now Columbia University. He helped launch or open the first opera house specializing in Italian opera in New York. He published 3 or 4 books or manuals of Italian usage, and his memoirs. I understand it's largely fiction, and it's in not 1, not 2, but 3 volumes, and in which he claims to have put Mozart on the map. And he lived to be almost 90 years old, and he was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Greenwich Village, but then his body was exhumed and put somewhere else. Nobody knows where his remains are, which is ironic because no one knows where Mozart's remains are either. But there is a monument to him in Calvary Cemetery in Queens. So when you're taking the bus from the airport into Manhattan, you go by a place you can wave, "Hey, Lorenzo." So I think that's an amazing life. So let's get back now to Vienna, where we belong, and the Marriage of Figaro. There's another composer who's very popular in Vienna, and in fact in the world, and that is Franz Joseph Haydn. And it's not always acknowledged that Haydn wrote quite a few operas himself. But with the Marriage of Figaro, Haydn, who was certainly awed by Mozart's genius, just the way Mozart was awed by Haydn's accomplishments. They were very good friends. In fact, reading what they had to say about each other is actually quite moving, because you don't always read kind words about a composer from another composer. But Haydn acknowledged immediately that Mozart was the superior composer of opera. And after Marriage of Figaro, he turned down commissions to write opera buffa because he said, why get me? Get Mozart, he's the guy. And I was reading an interesting article about these two composers. Haydn was a tremendously accomplished composer. And why are Mozart's operas so successful and so popular? And the answer is he creates human beings in his characters. He goes far beyond the types of characters that would be recognizable in a sort of commedia dell'arte sense. And he creates living, breathing human beings with human characteristics. And he doesn't just do it with the superior texts of Da Ponte. He does it with the somewhat elliptical texts of the opera seria and the not always uncomplicated maze-like gyrations of Abduction from the Seraglio or the Magic Flute. He just creates people that we believe to be people. How many people in the room have read Pride and Prejudice? Okay, oh, so many people. And at the end of that novel, you feel if someone came up to you and said, you know, Elizabeth Bennet's only a fictional character, you'd smack them. She feels like an actual person. Same with Susanna in this work, same with the Countess, same with Figaro. You feel like they're actual people. Mozart and Da Ponte managed to find so many layers of characteristics to them. And Mozart is able to write music that could only really come out of the mouth of Susanna. You would never put an aria by Fiordiligi into the role of Susanna. I'm going to tell you more about those people in a minute. So that's essentially what we're looking at with the Mozart Da Ponte operas, is a real dramatis personae, a real cast of characters. And I should mention that the art or the tradition of creating an operatic text completely from scratch virtually doesn't exist. So almost all operas, just like almost all plays by Shakespeare, have a source that is then adapted. And this one was contemporary. You'll know Ian said that next year we're featuring Verdi's Rigoletto. That was also contemporary. And like the Marriage of Figaro, it was controversial. It was a little bit radical for Mozart and Da Ponte to accept, to take this project on for the following reason. It was based on a play that's part of a trilogy by the French playwright known as Beaumarchais. He's basically known universally as Beaumarchais. That wasn't his real name. Do you know why he's called Beaumarchais? It's amazing, this guy. He's fit right into the world of Lorenzo Da Ponte. He invented a mechanism for a watch that allowed the watch to run, it controlled the way the watch ran so it wouldn't go out of time. Apparently he'd failed to patent it and somebody else sort of beat him to that, but he is the person who invented this. It's still in use in wind-up wristwatches to this very day. So Beaumarchais, well run. Like he's named after his invention. He also supplied arms to the revolutionaries of the American War in 1776. So, amazing guy. And he was also deeply critical of the French monarchy and of the way society was being run by people who he felt had no real entitlement to their wealth or to their influence or to their authority. So I mentioned that this is part of a trilogy. I'm going to talk about at least a little bit about the other two during the course of this presentation. But the Marriage of Figaro, the Nozze di Figaro, falls right in between the two, the first and third. And like all three of Mozart Da Ponte's creations, it has an extra title, The Marriage of Figaro or The Madness of a Day. So all of the action of this opera takes place in the course of one day, from the morning to the evening. So I think that it is helpful, although not absolutely necessary that you remember that, but it makes the opera that much more exciting if you keep in mind that these events, you're watching them almost in real time. So what the play does is challenge the leading class, the ruling class, and it asks a very important question, which Mozart does keep in the text. I should say Mozart Da Ponte, and that is this: what did you do to earn the right to boss other people around and to earn all this wealth that you'll never spend in a whole lifetime? What did you do? You took the trouble to be born. That is all. And it reminds me of something Beethoven was to say to one of his aristocratic patrons. Yeah, you're a prince. There's hundreds of princes. There's only one Beethoven. So Beethoven got away with it, and I think Mozart did too. Because in actual fact, the Nozze di Figaro, the Marriage of Figaro, was banned from being performed in Vienna. Even with so comparatively liberal an emperor as Joseph, it was just too close to the core. And it felt threatening to the ruling class everywhere. But you could, if you wanted to, go to a bookstore and buy a copy of it. So that's what they did. And they set about making an opera of it before there was permission to do so, and before there was any theater booked or any singers booked or any actual guarantee that they'd make a dime from doing it. That is completely contrary to the practices of Mozart at any other time in his career. So they must have been very confident of two things: that they would get the permission and they would get it for Emperor Joseph, because Emperor Joseph, among his other qualities, knew talent when he saw it and he admired it. And this may be one of the reasons why both of these artists suffered a little bit from the jealousy and envy of the other members of the Italian operatic community, because they sort of jumped the queue a little bit. But Emperor Joseph enabled that, and he gave them permission to present this work. Now, one of the things that Mozart and Da Ponte did for sure is that they took away the very sharp edges of Beaumarchais' radical social criticism and humanized the characters a great deal more. I think that if there were a French literature professor in the room who would contradict me, I'd be happy to hear this. But to me, only ever having read the Beaumarchais translation, the Mozart Da Ponte opera vastly outdoes it, just in terms of artistic quality. But it wouldn't have existed without the Beaumarchais, and it received its premiere in 1786 in Vienna and was successful. It then was transferred to Prague, where it was mega successful. It was like an uber hit. And when Mozart went to Prague to see it, he said, you just hear the tunes everywhere. You hear them in the plaza, in the piazzas, and in the cafes, and in the bars. If they'd had elevators, you would have heard the tunes in the elevators. And so Mozart had a huge following in that city, and the Marriage of Figaro was very popular there. Now, before I get on to the ingredients and to some explanations of some of what makes up a Mozart Da Ponte opera, I do want to talk a little bit about the Barber of Seville, which precedes it. It's just one of those accidents of history that by far the most popular setting of the Barber premiered about 30 years after Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, although the events in the story precede it. So many of the characters in Barber of Seville are the same as the ones we meet in the Marriage of Figaro. We have young Count Almaviva, who has disguised himself as an impoverished young student so he can win the love of a woman he's fallen in love with who is very, very heavily guarded by her protector or her guardian. And so he wants her to fall in love with him rather than his money. And this young lady's name is Rosina. You remember her from Barber of Seville, right? And she's fun, she's full of life, and she's full of humor, and she's determined to get what she wants, which is this young student. However, the guy who's looking after her is Dr. Bartolo. And if I can describe him like this, he's basically a dirty old man. He wants to get his hands on Rosina's money, but he's quite happy to get his hands on her as well. So he's keeping her completely sequestered from the world. So she only goes out when she has to go to church. Big mistake happens in Rigoletto as well. That's where she meets the Count, disguised as the impoverished student. She has a singing teacher named Don Basilio. He'll also appear in the Marriage of Figaro. And of course, there's Figaro. Now, people know the most famous, or one of the most famous utterances in all of opera is when some guy stands in the middle of the stage and goes, Figaro, Figaro, Figaro. That's from the Barber of Seville. It's not from the Marriage of Figaro. And he's basically a general factotum. He does everything. Barbers used to perform surgery. Did you know that? That's why they have that red and white circulating thing. You can go have a shave and a haircut and an appendectomy all in the same afternoon from the same person. So he does everything. And one of the things he does, he knows his way around Seville. And so he is enlisted by the Count to help get Rosina away from the clutches of her guardian and into his arms, and that's what happens. So now it's some time later, and they are settled at the estate of the Count, Count Almaviva, which means the soul of life, just in the outskirts of Seville. So he's very, very rich. The Countess is only mentioned by name once or twice in the whole of the libretto of Marriage of Figaro. She's referred to as Madama la Contessa. And I'll mention her a little bit later too. So now we are in this estate, and the two leading characters are not the Count and the Countess, they are their servants. Figaro has been given the position of the Count's valet. Now, this means he's a servant, but it means he's at the top of the pecking order of the servants. But he's still now very subservient to the Count, and he's not a free agent anymore. But he does have job security. And he's engaged to be married to the Countess's chambermaid, who is Susanna. Susanna comes from a family of servants. Her cousin Barberina and her uncle Antonio are also among the servants of the estate. This is already unusual, that the very first people we meet are servants. And it's also, as we will find out during the course of the first scene, it is their wedding day. What this means is, and Beaumarchais' audience, Mozart's, Da Ponte's audience would all have known this, that they have applied to the Count for permission to marry, and he's given it to them. And what Beaumarchais introduced into this is something called le droit de seigneur, which means the right of the Lord. The servants would generally present their ruler with something like maybe a collection of vegetables from their garden, or a calf or something like that, in appreciation, as a gesture of appreciation for the Count's generosity in allowing them to get married. In Beaumarchais, he ups the ante quite a lot by suggesting that the Lord, the Count, has the right of the first night with the bride. And this is alluded to in the libretto as something that has been done away with by the Count. In the first flush of his love for Rosina, I guess he didn't think he'd ever lust after any girls. Now he's lusting after every girl that he sees, and servants are not out of his reach. And Susanna's nice looking, and he thinks he'd really like to have a go at her. I think underneath this, there's a little bit of male envy as well, because he understands that Figaro is a lot smarter than he is. That's never said, but it's implied in both of those plays. So he wants to bring that back, but he's going to have to outsmart everybody, including his wife, in order to do this. We've all had the experience, haven't we, of having rulers or leaders of government who are really distrustful of anyone smarter than they are, and which includes most of the population. And so that's really essentially the situation that the Count is in. So we're going to open this actually with an ensemble, and I'm going to sort of play you some of this now before we introduce some of the other characters. Because immediately we find ourselves doing something or in the middle of something that is not common, and that is this. They're working. What Susanna and Figaro are doing is each of them preparing for something that has to do with their wedding. Figaro is measuring the room that the Count has given them so that as their bridal room to make sure it can fit their wedding bed. Susanna is modeling the bonnet that she has made for her wedding. She says, it suits me so well it could have been made by me, which of course it was. So Figaro's music is businesslike, almost militaristic. That's, as it were, the first subject or tune, and that will accompany Figaro. Now we have a tune introduced by the orchestra that is going to be Susanna's. It's much more lyrical, much less rhythmic. And that will create two different sort of states of mind, as it were. Figaro just comes in counting. 5, 10, 20. He's counting the number of feet that are available to him for the marriage bed, and Susanna's singing rapturously about her bonnet and trying to get Figaro to look at it and to admire it. Now, one of the interesting things about music is that it can basically create, without a single word, a kind of hierarchy. And by the end of this short duet, they're both singing Susanna's theme. And what that tells us really is that Susanna rules the roost. And we will learn this throughout the course of the Marriage of Figaro. Figaro is certainly smart. He's smarter than the Count. He's more devious. He's had to learn how to outwit people who outrank him. But Susanna really carries all the cards. She's smarter than everybody else in the opera put together. And so she will ultimately really triumph. Now, after that duet is concluded, we have our first passage of what is called recitativo secco. Now, recitativo is basically where we have the plot in the piece. When we have the ensembles and the arias, that's more like a Shakespearean soliloquy, where a character is basically meditating and thinking about and expressing feelings about the dramatic situation as it has unfolded. But the recitative is like the dialogue that carries the plot. And so it's generally, there are pitches that the singers have to sing. And it's given note value, so it has rhythm, but the singers are expected to make alterations to the rhythm so that it sounds like spoken Italian. And if anybody's ever been to Italy, they kind of already sing when they speak. And not only because the language is so mellifluous, but also because they just have that way of speaking to each other. They also have a language that lends itself well to rapid delivery. So Mozartian recitative is generally pretty quick. So that's the first thing about recitative, is that it is meant to sound like the natural rhythms of speech, rather than like the metrical dance-like rhythms of an aria. Now, secco means dry, and what that denotes is, and much of the recitative in Mozart, I'm going to say most of it, is recitativo secco, and what it means is that it's accompanied only by harpsichord. Quite possibly, it's more authentic to have it accompanied by harpsichord with a bass playing instrument like cello that can hold the bass lines. But for the most part, it's much more practical just to have a harpsichordist, and they give us these little chords that help give it a kind of harmonic structure. And the harpsichordist is therefore responsible for following the singer and making sure that the chords are with the correct syllables, but also the singer might do a little bit of action, might do a little hand gesture, and the harpsichordist is free to make a little blip on the harpsichord to accompany the action as well. All of the music played on the harpsichord during a recitativo secco is improvised. based on what is provided in the bass line. I'll show you a little bit. So it's very important to follow the words of the recitative. The words in the recitative are way more important than the music, which is it's the exact opposite when we have the ensembles and arias. Because it is now that we find out from Susanna, because Figaro is a man and therefore not as smart, from Susanna we find out that the Count is, he has dishonorable intentions, and having them move to a room so close to his own is really perhaps he has ulterior motives. And so through the course of this little scene, we have a lot of plot detail that is given to us in the recitative, and then we have the emotional response in the ensembles. So it's here that we find out what's up. Susanna basically says, so tell me, my little Figaretto, what exactly are you doing? And Figaro says, well, I'm just making sure that the space I've been measuring will accommodate our bed that the Count will give us. You mean we'll sleep here? Absolutely. The Count was kind enough to make this our bedroom. Well, you can have it, as far as I'm concerned. You don't like it? I should say that I don't. So what's wrong with it? And she goes on to say, I just don't want to tell you about it. But ultimately, she's going to have to point out that this makes her more available to the Count, because the Count can very easily order Figaro to do something. And so the dialogue will sound something like this. So no one's going to go out of the theater humming that, right? But you just follow it so that you can follow the plot. And Mozart is the best composer of recitativo who ever lived. So it's not unmemorable, it's just that the words are more important. And it will lead to some more music that is meant to be appreciated as music that is illuminating character, if I can say that. And now I want to introduce you to the whole idea of the orchestra. At the very beginning of a Mozart opera, we have an overture. And interestingly enough, in all of the Mozart operas, the overture and the very last number of the whole opera are in the same key. There's a kind of key organization. In Marriage of Figaro, it's D major. So the overture is in D major. It's been described as a rather bumptious and energetic little piece. And one of my favorite writers about Mozart opera, a guy with the wonderful name Spike Hughes, says it is no such thing. It's actually representing the intrigue that goes along with life in one of these estates. And although it has wonderful outbursts of sound, a lot of it is quite soft, like the little whispered intrigues and gossip that are the very stuff of an estate like the Count's. So I've mentioned Susanna and Figaro. Now I'm going to mention Dr. Bartolo, because he does come on. And Dr. Bartolo, we'll learn, is basically consumed with revenge fantasies about Figaro. Figaro, he feels, is responsible for taking the Countess away from him when she was just Rosina. Of course, the Count did that, but Dr. Bartolo can't do anything to him. So he's determined to ruin Figaro's life one way or the other. And he has in his company a former servant named Marcellina. And Marcellina is the play's dirty old woman. At least she is until a certain crucial point in the dramatic plot. And she has, now this is an opera, so it has some improbable things in it, and this is one of them. At one point earlier, Marcellina has loaned Figaro a substantial sum of money, and the contract that she drew up gives the condition that if he doesn't pay her by a certain day, and of course it is today that he has to pay her, then he will marry her. He must have been pretty confident he'd raise that money, but anyway, he hasn't paid her. So they're determined to bring this to the attention of the Count, and therefore act as the Count's ally in his wish to debauch Susanna. So you're going to see that. You're going to see an aria that's worthy of a Greek god, sung by Bartolo. He's so determined to wreak vengeance. La vendetta, he says. Now we're going to meet one of opera's favorite characters, and this is Cherubino. So Cherubino, and that does sound a little bit like a little angel, right? Cherubino is a page boy, so he's in the service of the Count as well. And this is a famous trouser role, as it should be and should remain. That means it's sung by a female singer. And Mozart must have just enjoyed this thoroughly, because during the course of the drama, Cherubino is dressed up as a girl. So a girl playing a boy who gets dressed up as a girl. They must have had wonderful conversations over glasses of wine about that one. And Cherubino is an adolescent boy. So he's just discovered women, girls. And he's desperately in love with every woman he sees. The Countess, Susanna's cousin Barberina, who's his sort of semi-official girlfriend. And at one point he sort of hints that even Marcellina would do in a dark room somewhere. But basically what Cherubino is a festering pestilence of hormones on two spindly little semi-aristocratic legs. And so we have found out that the Count discovered him at Barberina's house. What the Count was doing at Barberina's house is never questioned, except we should ask. We will find this information out in a very funny way. But Cherubino comes to Susanna and says, please intercede with the Countess on my behalf, because I don't want to get fired. And he sings this little song about how he doesn't know what's happening to him. He's ice cold one moment and raging hot the next. He doesn't know what to think. He doesn't know what to do. All he can think about is love. And we know what that translates into L-U-S-T when we're talking about teenage boys. And all he can think about is girls. And he just wants to talk about love all the time. He'll talk about love with anyone he meets, with animals in the forest, with the trees, with the mountains, even just by himself. And so he sings this aria. And this is where I think the orchestra in Mozart's hands really illustrates what the character might be thinking and feeling underneath. Because if all I play is that, you still get this feeling of agitation and restlessness. With those little offbeat figures that are given to the violins. And even to this day, it's almost impossible to hear an orchestra be absolutely 100% together during those, because they have to play on the offbeats. And that's part of it, I think. That's part of what Mozart wants to achieve, is the underlying feeling of restlessness and of agitation. Now, another illustration of Figaro's character that I want to give you is from one of the most famous arias. In fact, it was so famous at that time that Mozart himself parodied it. And this is when we find out that Cherubino has been given a reprieve, sort of. The Countess said, okay, I won't fire you. I'm going to put you in my army instead, which is the last place Cherubino wants to be, because there aren't any girls in the army. Plus, Cherubino's a bit of a fop. He likes to wear his nice clothes. He certainly likes to eat nice food. And he certainly doesn't want to be bullied by a bunch of other rough men, but that's what it looks like will happen to him. And Figaro takes advantage of this opportunity to make fun of him. After all, Figaro has a very good-looking fiancée, and Cherubino has eyes. So he basically says, no more adventures with love for you, young fellow. You're going to go into the army now. And he lists all the things, all the deprivations that Cherubino's going to have to undergo. But all of this music sounds like a march, which is what it's meant to do. Became so popular, one can imagine that was one of the tunes that people were whistling in the bars and piazzas of Prague. That became so popular that it made an appearance the next year in Don Giovanni, which of course was written for Prague. It went to Prague first and then to Vienna. And there's this scene where the Don is having supper, or preparing a supper. He has his own private band, and they're playing hit tunes of the day. And that was one of them that's played. And the Don turned, oh, stop playing that piece. You just never hear anything else these days. I'm sick and tired of it. So anyway, I want to play you now the beginning of Act 2. We will meet the Count, and we'll meet Don Basilio. He's a kind of weasel. I feel rather sad that he's the music teacher. And we'll hear a great deal about Susanna's cousin Barberina, although we don't meet her for quite a while. But the leading character we don't meet at all, and is only vaguely alluded to, well, now she's very importantly alluded to, is the Countess. We don't meet her until Act 2. And she begins Act 2 all by herself. And she is nothing like the Rosina that you will have remembered from the Barber of Seville. She's very sad now because her husband seems to have lost all interest in her. At least as a man, as a count, he's interested in her because he imagines that she's behaving the way he is. In other words, he imagines that she's having an affair with another person, possibly Cherubino. So he's full of jealousy and suspicion. She isn't, she's quite innocent. Now, I'm just going to play you the opening of the orchestra that begins Act 2, because there's no doubt in anyone's mind that this is music that's being written for an aristocratic lady, and I mean aristocratic in personality. If she could be a shepherdess, but she's a lady. She's dignified, and she is a lady who's undergoing distress, and she does not like to think about expressing it to other people. She just is enduring it herself. So that, again, is music that we're going to associate with poignancy, right? With sadness. We haven't really heard anything like it in all of Act 1, so it's the Countess's music for sure. And that brings me to one more ingredient. We've talked a little bit about the arias and ensembles, and a little bit about the opening overture, and about recitativo secco. Now we have to talk a little bit about recitativo accompagnato. And I'm going to tell you that there are 4 outstanding examples in the Marriage of Figaro. They occur later on in the opera. And the one I want to play for you is actually from the Count. I'm just trying to think yes, I do. This creates a kind of overall structure known as a scena or scene. And you will be familiar with it if you've ever gone to any Rossini opera. It is where we begin with a type of recitativo that's accompanied now by the full orchestra. The accompaniment isn't continuous the way we would expect in an aria. It's more like punctuation. And these types of recitative still give us a kind of movement of plot in terms of what the words are saying, but they are reserved for the high points of the plot. And generally they're reserved for major characters as well. And the orchestra kind of gives us a punctuation, but also a little bit of psychological insight into what the character is experiencing. And one of the reasons I like this one from the Count is because it gives a tiny little bit of poignancy. It humanizes him a little bit. Very hard to humanize this character. And he's just heard Susanna saying that, well, we'll win our case. I'm not going to tell you the plot development that this is revolving around, because it's just too good. But I will tell you that the most unbelievable sequence of events is related to us in a recitativo secco. So you have to pay attention. So anyway, the Count overhears Susanna saying this, and the Count is paranoid about anyone outwitting him. And of course, just about everybody's capable of doing just that. And so he's kind of thinking, what on earth? What can she be thinking about? And this launches him, first of all, into a series of sort of questioning, self-questionings. And then he sings a double-barreled aria, one in which there's, first of all, a very majestic or dignified aristocratic utterance, and then a rapid one as his rage really boils over. So it's a virtuoso scene for the singer who's delivering the role. 2 things about that. Most of the time, the Count is too old. I saw a film of it, which is in many ways good, until you realize Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau was 50 when he made it. He looks every minute of it. So the Marriage of Figaro now has 2 dirty old men in it. The Count shouldn't be more than he should be able to be convincingly about 23. They rarely are. And the Countess should be maybe 21, maybe even 19. They're young marrieds. So as soon as they start looking like middle-aged marrieds, the plot loses a little bit of its immediacy. Anyway, I won't rant on anymore about that. except to say this. The great German mezzo-soprano Christa Ludwig was being interviewed, and she was asked about mics in an opera house, and she said, well, I'd rather have a young singer microphone than see some 63-year-old Mimi. This was in Chicago, and the next season had just been announced, and the role of Mimi was being played by the 63-year-old Mirella Freni. So I think that was kind of a pointed reference. In any case, some effort should be made to ensure that the Count still looks like a young, virile, attractive man, however unattractive his personal traits are. So anyway, this little bit of this passage I'm going to play you from the Recitativo Accompagnato I think is very telling. Hai già vinta la causa, you have won the decision. He just sings it, and then we have a punctuation from the orchestra. Which is typically what we'll hear when the orchestra joins in with the recitative. But then he reflects, is it possible that Figaro has actually succeeded in paying back Marcellina that loan? Because he knows that if he does, if he is able to do that, then the Count will have much, much, much less likelihood of getting his own way. So in those 4 bars, we're invited to feel a little bit sorry for the Count. We're at least invited to think that whatever he's going through is genuine. Only for 4 bars, then he gets mad again and turns into his old self. So there is another scene created for the Countess, which ends with a certain degree of hope. There is a scene for Figaro, and I get into this plot, this little bit of plot development. Figaro's a man, as I've said earlier, so he's not quite as smart as Susanna, and he begins to think that if there's smoke, there must be fire. So maybe she really is fooling around with the Count. And so Susanna has to teach him a lesson in the last act, and she does this by letting him think that maybe she is after all. And so he has this incredible rant. You have to watch these words in his Scena, where he seems to compare himself to all of the suffering that has ever been undergone by every single immortal god in all of the Greek mythology. And then finally, and perhaps the greatest one of all, is Susanna herself, when she's alone. As the intrigues of the last act are being acted out, she just reflects a little bit on the happiness she is now convinced will occur with her Figaro. So let's see if there's any other things that I wanted to mention. We have to talk about the very ending. I think I've managed to mention all of the characters. I will now talk a little bit about a tradition that was very much part of the Viennese opera scene. It was so much a part of it that Da Ponte and Mozart actually consciously set out not to observe these traditions. And one of the most important ones is the whole art of the finale. This work has 4 acts. In the second one, we have a great big long finale, and in the fourth one, we have a great big long finale. And the tradition was that all the characters would come out in the order in which they had been introduced and sing in the finale, even if that made absolutely no sense to the plot. So Da Ponte was having none of that. So the finales actually have their own kind of plots, they have their own kind of logic, and Mozart, of course, matches this in the music. Also, the characters are interwoven into a society. It's not like there's the aristocratic characters, and then we get comic relief from the shepherds and shepherdesses, which had been very much part of comic opera before. They interweave with each other, they interconnect. Both the Count and the Countess will refer to the inferiority of their servants. The Countess and Susanna have quite a warm relationship, but it's still one between a mistress and her maid. And the Countess, one of the things that she reflects on is how her husband, with his jealousy, his immoral behavior, his neglect of her, has driven her to seek the help of her own servant, which is something that is beneath the dignity of her position in society. The Count is more direct and more selfish, and he says, why should a servant enjoy something I can't have? Meaning his own wife. So those are the things that the way we glimpse into this society. Personally, I feel the Marriage of Figaro moves itself from one period of history to another only quite uneasily. and perhaps a Gosford Park type of servant relationship. We saw it in Downton Abbey and in Upstairs, Downstairs. There is a pretty rigid class system observed even within the organization of servants. If you occupied a higher position among the serving class than somebody else, you let that person know that. So those things need to be understood as we're looking at this piece, even as that system is being attacked. So basically, the very important element of the plot twist is that Susanna agrees to meet with the Count at dusk in the garden. And the Countess and Susanna co-conspire to put him in this compromising position. And then they exchange clothes. So the very costume of the servant and the aristocratic lady defines who they are, so that the Count, at least when it's not 100% light out and he can't see really clearly, will easily mistake his wife, not for a hat, but for his servant. And this way he gets caught. He gets sort of snared in his own trap. And everybody has said, can you please forgive the people he thinks are carrying on, the Countess and Figaro? No, I won't. No, not ever, ever, ever. And it turns out he then hears his wife's voice, and she says, I will be more generous than you. And there's, I think, one of the most moving passages in any opera is when the Count has to implore his wife for forgiveness, and without hesitation, she forgives him. And then everyone sings a little finale. Everyone's going to go in, there's going to be fireworks, there's going to have a nice supper, and then Susanna and Figaro will be married, so it has a happy ending, right? Let's look at the third play in Beaumarchais' trilogy, which is called La Mère Coupable, or The Guilty Mother. And in this, the Count, of course, goes back to his philandering ways immediately. The power of Mozart's music is such that it can convince us that they have a happy ending together. But for 99% of the opera, he's really a pig. So it can't come as any surprise that he goes back to his philandering ways. And the Countess, at this point, a little bit more Rosina from the first play, she's had enough. She figures, okay, if he's going to do it, so am I. If he's going to suspect me of doing it, I'm at least going to get the pleasure of doing it. So she becomes pregnant and bears a child whose father is Cherubino. Cherubino goes to the war and is killed in the war. Now, of the three plays, I think unquestionably the most radical is The Marriage of Figaro, and it was perceived that way during its own time. The play was considered the first real stroke of revolution in the French Revolution, and it's no wonder that, that governments and ruling classes everywhere banned it. But Mozart and Da Ponte, as I said, they kind of bring it to life. It's brilliantly written, of course, but it is a political broadsheet compared to the opera that you're going to see, the opera buffa. I think I've told you everything I need to, or wanted to tell you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
What was Da Ponte's real name?
I forget. I think Baruch was his Christian name. And I should look at, I've looked that up about 20 times. It's just one of those pieces of information that eludes my memory. But all of the brothers had to take a suitably Gentile name.
Thank you.
Why do you think Mozart and Da Ponte didn't collaborate on part 1 and part 3 of the series?
I suspect they may have found part 3 not suitable for an opera, but somebody else named Paisiello had set The Barber of Seville already. It's not as famous or as popular as the Rossini. And keeping in mind also that Emperor Joseph died in 1790, Mozart himself in 1791, so Da Ponte got out of Dodge. So they may have collaborated on other things, but history had other ideas. Yes?
Did they write it at the same write and set the music at the same time?
Yes. Now, this is where some of the most frustrating historical coincidences happen. We have wonderful correspondence between Verdi and his librettist Arrigo Boito, and if anything, even better correspondence between Strauss and his librettist Hugo von Hofmannsthal. But Mozart and Da Ponte both lived in Vienna. There was no need for them to write letters. They just went and visited each other. So we have no idea what their working relationship was really like. We have some idea. Mozart, in fact, was a bit suspicious of Da Ponte, but that's only, I think, in a letter he wrote to his father, and I take all of those letters with a grain of salt. So we don't know. But they were writing them at the same time. One can see Da Ponte delivering passages of text, and then Mozart would set them to music while he went home and wrote some more words.
So it started basically with the words, with the story.
Yes.
Ironic that, of course, Mozart is the one who's most vividly remembered.
Well, that's always the case, I think. Timothy Vernon is fond of pointing out that von Hofmannsthal's libretto for Der Rosenkavalier is just about the only libretto that's ever been put on as a play, separate from the music. And that makes sense, because let's look at that. I mean, I don't think the Barber of Seville has had a life really outside of France. But let's look at Shakespeare. When we look at Othello, that uses about a third of the original text, because music needs a lot more space. And I shouldn't say this as a rebuke against any stage directors, because it's not meant to be, but there are so many recordings of operas, of just the music and the singing and the orchestra playing. There are no silent movies of stage productions of any operas. There is a silent movie of Carmen, and it starred an opera star, Geraldine Farrar. Well, thank you so much again for coming to this presentation, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the Royal for the Marriage of Figaro. Thank you.